Good morning, America. How are ya? Monday morning rail will be 500 miles before the day is dawn. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'm your native son. Hi, I'm Denny Jelsma, and I'm at the world-famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida. And today is Monday, and you know what we do on Monday? You guessed it. We do a show and tell. But before we get started, there's a few things I want to talk about. First of all, the show and tell is sponsored by Jelsma.com, Jelsma Graphics, America's railroad embroiderer since 1985. 38 years of selling railroad clothing to the railroads and railroad fans around the world. You could go on the Jelsma Graphics website. It's Jelsma.com. It's Jelsma.com. We are in the process of updating our web page. It's going to be really exciting, and we'll have that in about 2 weeks. But you can still go on and order. Also, you could see the What's Neat this week with Ken Patterson show on YouTube. You could find our show on Facebook under Denny G Jelsma on Facebook, and on YouTube under Denny G. And you could go to Ken Patterson What's Neat this week and see his show, and Jelsma Graphics sponsors that show as one of the sponsors. And also I'm on the show quite a bit, and they did a whole segment on the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum that you could watch. And we want to thank all of the viewers, the thousands every week. It just keeps growing. And so make sure that you hit the like and subscribe on Facebook, hit like on YouTube, make sure that you hit the like and also subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate it. We've even got to the point that we're going to have to kind of limit our autographs and photograph sessions, and so we've decided to keep some of the members private, that you could get an autograph or a photograph on Friday morning from 9 to 9:30. Now, with all that said, let's start show and tell. Well, show and tell starts right now. We have a very exciting show today, and this Monday I've been excited all weekend because we're talking about one of the favorite subjects in railroading, and that is the dome cars. And we was first introduced to the dome cars back in the early 1940s. A guy named Cyrus Osborne. He was an executive with General Motors, and he was the head executive for the EMD, and they made electromotive engines. And he was riding in the cab of a Rio Grande because he was studying the freight movement of the war effort. And he was in Glenwood Canyon in 1944, and he was looking up out of the engine's window, and he thought, wow, what a beautiful view. And so he got a piece of paper and he sketched what he thought would be an idea to have a windows on top of a passenger car that people could look out. He got back to Chicago, and he met with the president of the CB&Q, and his name was Bud. He was no relation to the Buds that ran the Bud car making in Philadelphia. The president of the railroad thought it was an excellent idea, and so he ordered his Aurora, Illinois shop, and that was the CB&Q's really main shop, was Aurora, Illinois, right outside of Chicago, to build the first dome. And what I have here is a model of the first dome. It was called the Silver Dome. And they took a coach car, and they took a Bud coach car, took the roof, and they added a dome. Now, all these glass was flat, and they were slanted. They had to lower the floor a little bit, and it took a little bit, but in 1945 they introduced it. The first run that they ran this car on was on the Exarban Zephyr from Omaha to Chicago. Everybody asked, why did they put that on the Exarban? Because the Exarban was kind of a secondary train on the east-west main to go out west through Iowa. And they ran this on the Exarban. They ran it and they tested it. It ran great. The people loved it. And so then they stuck it on the Minneapolis train, the morning and afternoon Zephyrs, and it was an absolute success. And so then the car went on what they call the Expedition Flyer, which ran from Chicago all the way to San Francisco. And it was mostly heavyweights, but then they put this here in the train, and once again it was an absolute success. The second car that the Aurora shops made were the Silver Castle. Now, these two brass models I have are very, very rare. I had this car professionally finished off by Reed Boys. He's a California painter, a real good friend of Coach Yard and Fred Hill. And Boyd is just an excellent painter. And he did this and I did this, so you could see the difference in the quality. But these are the two domes that started this whole dome syndrome, and boy did it take off. Then in 1947, General Motors, along with Cyrus Hall Osborne, decided to make the Train of Tomorrow. And the Train of Tomorrow is a car that's right here. Later went to the Union Pacific, and they had Pullman Standard making, because EMD and Pullman was near each other in the Chicago suburbs, and there was a 4-car, and it went on tour for about 2 years, and it was an absolutely great success, along with the Expedition Flyer of the CB&Q. The Burlington then placed an order with Bud out of Philadelphia, car maker, and they made the stainless steel California Zephyr. But this is the Train of Tomorrow. This train ended up, the Union Pacific bought it, and it ran on service from Portland to Seattle and was very, very successful. And this is one of the cars. Now, we're going to go back and I'm going to talk about the different domes, and we're going to just kind of take them by railroads. And so the CB&Q, first, after the California Zephyr was introduced, they put domes on the morning and afternoon Twin Cities Zephyr. And the dome was up a little farther here, and once again it was just an absolute success. The Burlington kind of pioneered having all of their trains having domes. This is naturally the California Zephyr. This is a brass car. This is a Broadway car. This is a Soho car that ran on the Kansas City Zephyr, and this is a nickel plate car, brass, that ran on the morning Zephyrs. And this, if you look at the very end, Bud made this car, and you could see this had a tail sign that said Kansas City Zephyr and the Denver Zephyr. The Denver Zephyr was advertised heavily between Chicago and Denver, and it had, I believe, 3 to 4 domes, here again according to the season and the passenger load. Now, the next railroad that entered into the domes was the Santa Fe. The Santa Fe had most of their cars. This was built by Bud, and this was built by Bud. And there were three manufacturers that made dome cars, and Cyrus Osborne shared the patent with the three car manufacturers, and that was American Car and Foundry out of St. Louis or St. Charles, the Pullman Company out of the suburbs of Chicago, and the Budd Company out of Philadelphia. And the Santa Fe had what they called, and they introduced this in 1954 along with the high level, and it was a full dome, and this ran on the San Francisco Chief and the Texas Chief. And it was a very popular car. This here was the El Capitan, and it was a high level double deck, and it had slanted roofs, and this was their lounge car. Then probably Santa Fe's most famous dome car was their Pullman Standard, and it ran on the Super Chief, and it had a private dining car on the bottom, and it was just a very luxurious train. Now, the Southern Pacific had domes that they called three-quarter domes, and so they were home shopped. In other words, they just took part of the Daylight fluted series that they had made in 1937, 38, and they put a three-quarter dome. This here was all the way up to the ceiling. It was just gorgeous. These cars are all brass. They had smooth side, they had corrugated side, and they even had one for the city train, the city of San Francisco, which they pooled with the Union Pacific. And so this was their entry into the Southern Pacific, only had three-quarter domes. Then we have the Union Pacific. The Union Pacific was a big player in the dome business, and their first car was made by American Car and Foundry out of St. Louis, and then they took, as I talked earlier about the Pullman Standard, the Train of Tomorrow, and they also had, and you could see the end here, they had observation cars. They had their famous dining car in the 8000 series, and you had dining in the top of the dome. And Union Pacific was really famous for that. And they even ended up leasing an ex-California Zephyr car, which a lot of the UP guys aren't really enthused about. So, okay, that was the Union Pacific cars. Now, there's some great books that I want to talk about. Dome Liners by Zimmerman and by Doran, The Domes. Both these books are out of print, but they're great reads, and they will give you a lot of information about the domes. And so today I've got to have some help because I've got so many cars here. And so I've got our Secretary Treasurer of the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum, Phil Schmitt, and we have the President, Rodney Burcher, and they are going to kind of help me with some of these cars. So with the next set of cars that I want to talk about is that is the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, the northern section. And you got to remember that the Northern Pacific, the CB&Q, the Great Northern, and the Seattle Spokane were owned by one holding company for years and years and years. And then in 1970, they decided to merge and make the Burlington Northern. So, Phil, why don't you come on in, Rodney, and you could kind of help me with some of these cars. What we're going to talk about here is the Great Northern. The Great Northern had sleeping car domes, and they had coach domes. And their famous train on the Great Northern was naturally the North Coast Limited. That was on the Northern Pacific. The Great Northern was the Empire Builder. and the Spokane, Seattle, Spokane, Portland, and Seattle. This car was painted just before the merger, and there's kind of a little story about that, is that the president was kind of upset that they were going to lose their identity, and so he ordered all of the Spokane and Portland cars painted in their railroad colors, and it was a car that went into the merger, and it was kind of a way that he kind of got back at the merger. But they had full domes, and then they had sleeping a car, what they call quarter domes. And so a total of 237 domes were made between 1945 or 1944 and 1958. And they were made by three companies: the Budd Company, the Pullman Standard, and ACF, American Car and Foundry. Okay, well, welcome guys to the world of domes.
Thank you, Denny. Yeah, Jacksonville was no stranger to domes. We were very fortunate, starting in 1959, to have our first regular assigned dome cars. They were leased from the Northern Pacific for service on the City of Miami and the South Wind, and they were used in the winter service. And the Northern Pacific car ran in its original paint on the South Wind. The Illinois Central repainted theirs, and they were a welcome sight. They were a beautiful car, and at night the northbound City of Miami came through, and to see those green windows in that dome car was just something that you'd always remember.
Now, is this the car that you
Yes.
first saw right there?
Yes. Now that car for the City of Miami was repainted in the chocolate. And the car ran in the winter service between 59 and 60. And they did not return again until 65. So the car ran in winter service essentially every year, but it did continue between 65 and 66 all year on the South Wind. So it was alternate, but the dome cars were a regular sight up and through the early years of the Seaboard Coastline. So they were a real special treat to have sleeper domes. And also, beginning in 65, 66 winter service, the Atlantic Coastline leased from B&O the Moonlight Series dome cars. They leased all three of them and simply put their herald on the car. They left it B&O, put their herald on the car, and ran it on the rear of the Florida Special between Miami and Richmond, because they didn't want the clearances north of from Washington north. And that was another beautiful sight. They only did it that one season. And before we go back to the other things, the Pullman Company went out of business, and the Hamburg Industries was contracted by Seaboard Coastline. They took over all of the sleeping car service for Seaboard Coastline, and they acquired all three Moonlight domes and painted them Seaboard Coastline, and they remained in service on the Florida Special and the South Florida Special and the Silver Star up into Amtrak, and Amtrak even used them briefly on the Floridian. So those cars had quite a heritage down here in Florida. And one more dome car that was here in Jacksonville was essentially this car. It was built as a C&O, bought by the Rio Grande, and then C.S. Root bought the car as his private car, and he made it a office car essentially, and it was stationed out of Jacksonville for many years, and then it went into storage, went to Daytona, and now it's in a college in Daytona Beach, completely restored. So that's our lineage of dome cars for the Jacksonville, Florida area. And also Amtrak continued to run dome coaches. Originally the Southwind was an Amtrak train, and then they renamed it the Floridian. It continued to have the Northern Pacific Dome, and shortly thereafter it was replaced by several variations of dome cars. And in the later years, until its discontinuance, it ran with a dome coach.
Now you rode those domes out of Jacksonville.
Yeah, I've ridden the Northern Pacific Dome sleeper. I never saw such a big bedroom on a train. The bedrooms on those dome sleepers were fantastic, and those Northern Pacific cars, they were one of the nicest cars that I've ever been on.
They were Bud cars.
Yes, they were the Bud cars with the semi-fluted. They were smooth looking, but yeah, that was a beautiful car. So I always enjoyed seeing them.
Well, Rodney, tell us about the Illinois Central cars that we have down here.
This is essentially one of the Northern Pacific cars repainted for City of Miami service. And the dome coach, this was a Bud version. I don't remember the Bud version. They acquired these from Missouri Pacific in the late 60s. I don't remember a dome coach Bud car being on the City of Miami. They bought the Bud and the Pullman version. And the Pullman version is the ones that I remember seeing in Jacksonville.
Okay, now we got the American Car and Foundry dome that is an ex-Wabash. Tell us about the history of the Southern and the Central of Georgia on that.
Yeah, essentially with the merge of the Southern, I'm sorry, not the merge, but when N&W acquired Wabash, and then Southern had a good partnership with N&W. Southern ended up acquiring these cars from N&W, and they were assigned to the Nancy Hanks 2 and then the newly formed Southern Crescent after the Southern and the Crescent were combined. But on the southern side of the Crescent, it ran south of Atlanta to New Orleans, and the Nancy Hanks 2 ran between Atlanta and Savannah. Eventually these cars all ended up in Southern service. The Pullman car went on the Southern Crescent, and this car, the ACF car, in the early 70s was assigned to the Asheville Special and continued on that train until its discontinuance.
Okay, now this here is a old AHM which has been custom. This here is a Repeato. This here is a Walters that has been custom done to make a sleeper by Mike Stamey. And so you've heard us talk about Mike Stamey. He is a world famous car builder. Now,
did you want to talk about the covered end on that car?
What they did, if you could kind of zoom in, number two, you could see they painted the front, and one of the reasons they did that is because the air conditioning down in the south was so intense that they had to cut some of the glare and the heat, and so they thought that by painting that would cut down on the heat because the air conditioning couldn't keep up, and so along with the humidity, the heat. Now, when they would turn these cars back in, they would take and strip these and put them back into Northern Pacific cars. Now, the next bunch of cars we're going to talk about is the Missouri Pacific. The Missouri Pacific had two cars. They had Bud and they had Pullman Standard. The Pullman Standard had a flatter window where these had a more round. These cars ran on the Colorado Eagle, the Texas Eagle, and after some time they put them on the Missouri River Eagle that ran from Omaha to Kansas City. But the Texas Pacific and the Mopac both had domes on their trains. The Texas Pacific was from El Paso to Dallas, and then Mopac took it into St. Louis. And so they were in the domes. They loved them, and they were very popular. And what actually ended up happening, most of these cars went to the Illinois Central. Okay, the next cars is the Wabash.
Push the right button.
Okay, we're going to talk about the Wabash car. Now, who I have with me is our Secretary Treasurer of the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum, Phil Schmitt, and you've seen him on a few other videos. So welcome to the wonderful world of domes.
Dome cars, yes.
Now, you are naturally was born and raised in St. Augustine.
Yes.
You a Florida boy, but your father was from East St. Louis area.
Yes, St. Louis.
And so this train here made a stop at Granite City, which was close to your hometown.
Yes.
And so I know your dad, being a railroader and worked for the railroad, saw this train right here.
Yes. So important question about this train. A couple
Okay.
important questions. I assume they were all air conditioned naturally.
Absolutely. And that was a problem when these cars went into the southeast because of the humidity. They didn't have the problem as much going into the southwest because of the humidity.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a problem. And but in the Midwest, going through the cornfields,
Not a problem.
not a problem, because they had maybe 30 days of really high heat. The rest was. Any other questions about these beautiful cars?
Well, a couple. I assume it was an upgrade if you're going to ride in the dome car over the coach. Probably a little increase in ticket price.
Only in the observation. And then this car was introduced, and the Bluebird was introduced in, I believe, 1950. And it was an all Bud car, and it was such a success that they needed to have more room, and they ordered another dome. And the story goes, now whether this is true or not, that Bud couldn't come up with the configuration that Wabash wanted fast enough, so they gave the contract for this car here, which is a American Standard car, to make a parlor car, and they wanted to have and so these two cars were extra fares, but the rest of the train was coach dome. Now you got to remember, the bean counters, the accountants of the railroads, did not like domes, and the reason they didn't like it was it didn't bring in revenue. And so they were always fighting with the executives on these dome cars. It had to make money, otherwise they didn't want it. And so, but this was added 2 years later, and this particular car here, it was scratch built by Mike Stamey of Southeast Models. This here is a Rapido car, and this is a brass car right here. Now, I know earlier you asked me what color was the carpet. And the carpet on the Bluebird was, guess what?
Blue?
Blue. You got it. And so.
I hate pop quizzes. Yes.
Okay, so this is the Wabash's entry into domes.
Bars in the cars?
Oh yes, this had a bar, this had a bar, and they did make money on the alcohol sales. Now, they had some states and some even counties, and there's a lot of stories where the local sheriff stopped the trains and said, "Hey, you cannot serve alcohol," and but that was very short-lived because the railroads had more lobbying power than the local county sheriff. But anyhow, like on the Bluebird, they had a total of 7 to 8 cars. When they had this, the original version was 7, and there was 8 cars. And the Wabash ran on the Kansas City, the city of Kansas City, and also the city of St. Louis. Now, the city of St. Louis, the Wabash cars were painted in the UP because the UP took Kansas City on to the west. Okay, now.
Can I interject? I overheard you talking about the bean counters and not being able to sell the seats in a dome car. Let me put this. I used to get on the Floridian here in Jacksonville just to ride to Birmingham. And imagine getting on the train at night, getting in your bedroom, getting everything tucked away, getting a cup of coffee or whatever, and sitting up there in the dome at night watching the old Mars light and the lights flashing by. It was so relaxing. And then you stay in that dome and you just get sleepy and you relax. You crawl into that nice tight fitted bed and go to sleep, and the next morning you go for a breakfast. Why would you not want to travel like that? Who wants to fight an airplane that you may not even get on? I do not understand it.
Well, I agree with you 100%.
My memories of train travel were just absolutely, look, when you get in your car and you go on a trip, you got to go to the restroom. Hey, on the train, you know where it is. You get hungry, you get thirsty, you know where it is. You're home. You get on a train, you take your shoes off, and it's home. It was just a wonderful, and you add a dome car to that, oh my, you couldn't ask for more.
Well, and that's the reason why the domes were so popular. And to the staying power of the domes, there were 237 domes in the dome era between 1944 and 1958. 237. The majority of those domes are still running, or they're still alive. Not all of them are running, but they were so popular. Now, Phil, I know you're going to ask me a question. What is this car right here? Well, when you think of the Rock Island, you don't think of dome cars. Well, in 1971, there were 3 railroads that told Amtrak that they didn't want to join for various reasons. And that was the Southern, the Rio Grande, and the Rock Island. The Rock Island ran a train from Chicago to the Quad Cities, which is on the Mississippi River. The Quad Cities of Davenport and Rock Island, Moline, and Bettendorf. And it was called the Quad Cities Rocket. And they leased a car from the Butterworth Company, and they ran that car for up until about 1976. And the car was called Big Ben, and it was a ex-CNO for the dome observation. It was sold to the Rio Grande. You heard Rodney tell the story. And one of these cars ended up in the Butterworth Company, and they ran it in private car service, and then they leased it to the Rock Island. And the car's name was Big Ben, and for a while they put Lamona, which was the owner's wife's name. And so this is the Rock Island's entry into the dome, and it was very, very popular. That car was always filled, and it had alcohol served on it. our next cars that I want to talk about is the Milwaukee. And you say, hey, that's not a Milwaukee. Well, it's a Chicago Northwestern. This was one that they bought from the Milwaukee. This was a Pullman Standard. And guess what this car inside colors were? Maroon. And it was very, very popular service. And the Milwaukee ran full domes. When they got it from Pullman Standard, they put in the air conditioning units themselves. They put in 2 of them instead of 1 to really make sure it was cold. And I brought the observation for the Hiawatha because a lot of people say, hey, this could qualify as a dome. It really doesn't, but it's pretty good when you sitting back there and you can see the domes. Now, the next cars we're going to go north to Canada.
So I would ask the question while we're looking at all these dome cars, did all 3 of the companies that manufacture passenger cars make dome cars?
Yes, all 3 made them. The American Standard did not have the curved glass, and there were some patent issues that Bud had. Now, American Car and Foundry, I think I'm right on this, but they paid some royalties to Bud on the glass, but I could be wrong on that. Now, what we have here, the Canadians really hopped in on the dome business. In 1955, they ordered a complete, I think it was 11 to 12 car set for their Canadian. And they named their observation cars always after national parks, and this is the 1955 version, and the later is like about in the 60s. And even the Canadian National got into the domes. They bought a lot of domes from other railroads. They bought some Milwaukee full domes, and they were painted in the black and white CNN. So, that is the Canadians. Now, I'm sure there's going to be a few domes that I have missed, but we're going to go back and we're going to show you the D&H was a very popular railroad in the east that went from actually you go from New York City to Montreal, and they bought some domes from the other companies and they repainted them, and they went along the Lake Champlain. It was a beautiful ride. And so in the later in the late 60s and the 70s. And then I got a version here of the California Zephyr car that was put into private service, that these domes just keep surviving. And have you ever rode the Grand Canyon Railroad? You have not, okay. The Grand Canyon Railroad took over from Williams, Arizona to the Grand Canyon Loop, and they called it the Grand Canyon, and they bought some domes and they painted it. The car I have here is a ICH car. It's not a very good, but I just wanted to show the people the different companies. Today, domes are running on private cars all over.
Cruise lines?
Cruise lines. You know, Phil, have you taken your wife to Alaska on a cruise yet?
That's a double no.
Okay, well, you're going to have to, because that way you could ride the domes. The domes have got a new life, and in the early 2000s, a company out of Colorado spent a lot of money on perfecting the curvature of this dome glass. And they took cars, and these are today and these were made in Colorado, and it's kind of ironic because the domes kind of really started in Colorado with a vision, and now the new domes that they're making are just absolutely unbelievable gorgeous. And what they've found out is one of the reasons why the California Zephyr was so popular to the tourist is because of the scenery that they got to see. The California Zephyr literally took about 8 hours longer from Chicago to San Francisco than the city of San Francisco on the Union Pacific. And it was more popular, especially during the summertime. And the UP catered more to the business traveler, where the CB&Q, Denver and Rio Grande and Western Pacific catered to the tourist. Now we have tourists that are dictating, they pay a lot of money to go on a cruise, and here you could go on a land cruise. And you could take the cruise ship to, like in Alaska, and then get on the train. And now they have one that's in Colorado that goes through the Glenwood Canyon, and other places that are planned. And these are the new domes for the 21st century.
Denny, you know, dome cars are just an interest that this can go on for several sections. And I don't believe I heard you say anything about auto train.
You're absolutely right.
I mean, we're talking about the ultimate dome train of the 70s. But lo and behold, one night at work, we had the McKinley people do a tour on the Florida East Coast. And they gave me the car to deliver to the Southern Railroad over in TY. So I delivered the car in the TY yard, and while we were tying the car up for interchange, the crew that was touring with the car was on it, and they allowed me to go through it, and they did a tour with it, and we talked about it, and they gave me a model of this car. Now, this particular car is the more modern version. The car that they gave me a model of was the Bachmann version of the ex-Santa Fe car. And they were just such great people, it was a lot of fun. And since then, we've also had the car with the open platform on the lower level. So in the off season, they tour these cars around the country, and they've been to Florida several times. And if you get a chance to keep up with it, and one more thing I want to promote is the Blue Mountain in Reading. They have acquired 2 of the ex-Milwaukee cars, and they are the most gorgeous thing. You need to go on their website and look them up. I just can't say enough. That whole railroad has done such a remarkable job.
And they also have a big dome, the ex-Santa Fe.
They have ex-Santa Fe, but I'm not sure that they own it because it's the only car they have restored. That railroad has acquired so many cars in the last 2 years and refurbished all of them that it's just unbelievable what those people have done. They started with virtually nothing. They saved the railroad from abandonment, and on the weekends they run 3 different trains out of Jim Thorpe. So if you get a chance, they're one of the most fun railroads. They've got over 50 cars, 50 passenger cars in service, along with RDCs, F units, and steam engines. So if you get a chance to look them up, it's really worth your time.
Yes. And Rodney, the reason why he moved that car, he was an engineer for 44 years on the Florida East Coast Railroad. So Thank you, Rodney, for that. These are,
Now, I do have a question.
yes.
We know that the D&H, they ran their dome only from Albany to Montreal. It never went south of Albany. Why didn't we see domes on the New Haven, the Pensy, the New York Central, the Lackawanna?
That was real something. The clearance, the clearance going through tunnels and signals, overhead obstacles, and that was a problem. One of the reasons why the B&O was able to run their train, they could run it all the way to New Jersey, was because the B&O had, the American Standard car was just a little bit lower than the Bud Dome. But it was, to answer the question, it was real simple. It was just clearance. And that was the...
Yeah. And I think I understand that at one time the Pensy considered building low-level domes, but that never came to fruition.
Yeah. Well, they had, that was a part of the program where they had those low-level cars, the Keystone cars they called them, and they were very rough riding.
This brings the point, the Seaboard Airline took a lounge sleeper and put windows in it and called it the Hollywood Beach and the Beach Series of the Seaboard Coastline.
Yeah, I was going to mention that.
Or the Sun Lounge car series.
And those cars are still running today.
Yeah, one was destroyed, but two are still running in private car service, and that allowed them to go all the way to New York. But they were first-class cars. Coach passengers could not go in them, but they were a beautiful car too. So, there's been so many variations, but the key point that I want to stress repeatedly, the railroads offered you something while you were traveling with them. The way the railroads destroyed passenger service was Southern Railroad's the prime example. Bronson did away with all the amenities. You want to sit in a coach all day and order a box lunch? He did away with dining cars because they weren't making money. You want to talk about bean counters? Well, I'd like the bean counters to travel on their own equipment. You do away with amenities, you slow the trains down, you discourage passengers. So that's what happened.
Well, bright side of that is that Bright Line now is making some great inroads in Florida, and that's very exciting. So that brings to an end our series on the dome cars. We thank you for watching, and that's the way it is at the world famous Jacksonville Terminal Railroad Museum in beautiful Jacksonville, Florida, where the sun always shines and running trains is a pleasure in peace and harmony and air-conditioned comfort.